Welcome to this presentation titled From Frontier to Territory to Statehood, Taking and Holding the Land That Became Ohio. I'm Edward J. Dodson. In 1893, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner produced an essay titled The Significance of the Frontier in American History that attempted to make the case for both a heightened egalitarianism and a populist democracy at the frontiers of migration across North America. Turner argued the people who had come to North America from the diverse societies of the European continent were transformed by life at the frontier and access to free or very inexpensive land. Of course, this is a complex story that involves conquest, force, and fraud. This presentation will focus on what might be accurately described as the first imperial conquest undertaken by the government and leaders of the newly established United States of America. This was a conquest initiated first by individual action, by people pulled ever westward by this unique opportunity to achieve the sense of independence that comes with owning, settling, and cultivating the land. An important guide for us in this story is historian R. Douglas Hurt, author of the book The Ohio Frontier, Crucible of the Old Northwest, 1720 to 1830, published in 1996 by Indiana University Press. The frontier territory stretched north and west from the Ohio River to Lake Erie. Professor Hurt echoes the same conclusions reached by Turner. He writes, "Men and women enjoyed an economic democracy based on relatively easy access to land. Relocation often meant that the frontier people were moving to take advantage of new opportunities rather than to escape failure." He then adds an extremely important element to this drama. Speculators helped settle the frontier by making land available at reasonable prices and in tracts small enough to be affordable, yet with enough acreage to support both safety-first agriculture and commercial farming based on land ownership. People of many different tribes settled across the Ohio region during the 17th and 18th centuries. The tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy claimed the region by right of conquest, but other tribes, the Wyandots, Shawnees, and Delawares, competed for control of the fertile land and the game animals that provided much of what they needed. Europeans first began to enter the region early in the 18th century to engage in the fur trade. French traders opened trade with the Erie people who lived along the southern shore of Lake Erie in villages and fortified towns. In exchange for furs to meet a growing European appetite, the tribal people obtained goods they had no means of producing themselves: iron axes and knives, brass cooking pots, wool blankets, guns, black powder, and lead. Their lives, their relations with one another and with the arriving Europeans were forever changed. The insatiable appetite for European goods caused the tribal people to overhunt and overtrap the regions they occupied. The powerful Iroquois Confederacy's solution was to use warfare to acquire new territory along and around Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. By 1654, they succeeded. The final tribe to meet defeat at their hands was the Erie. The Shawnee people began to enter the region early in the 18th century, leaving Pennsylvania after relations with the colonial government there began to deteriorate as the colonials moved westward through Pennsylvania. As their numbers increased, they too were threatened by the Iroquois, who the colonials looked to as a protective buffer between themselves and the French in Canada. By 1738, the Shawnees had established a town at the mouth of the Scioto River, which became the center of a quasi-Shawnee republic. By this time, much of trade was conducted with the English, who provided higher quality goods at lower prices than could be offered by the French. Trade relations for the French worsened in 1745 after their fort at Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island fell to the British during King George's War. The loss of Louisbourg temporarily strangled the supply of French trade goods to the interior. The struggle between France and Britain for control over North America would continue for another 2 decades. British traders moved in to meet the demand by tribes for European goods. At the end of King George's War, the Canadian governor dispatched a force from the Great Lakes down the Allegheny River to the Ohio River, charged with directing all British traders to remove themselves from French territory and to encourage the tribes to return north. In his report, Captain Céloron de Blainville wrote, "The Shawnee and the Miami in Ohio were very badly disposed towards the French and are entirely devoted to the English." The British responded by demanding that the French withdraw and remain north of the Ohio River. The French were in a better position to militarily hold Ohio territory because their force was relatively close at Detroit. As a result, the region's tribes allied with the French, although their real objective was to keep their territory free from either British or French control. When the British emerged victorious over the French, they claimed the Ohio region as theirs by right of conquest. They also viewed tribal peoples to be subjects of the British Empire. The British now prevented the reopening of trade pending the release of colonials captured by the tribes during the war. Another problem on the Ohio frontier was that Britain's treasury was drained. They were not in a position to construct and man the needed chain of forts across the Great Lakes region. Fort Sandusky, destroyed in 1761 by Ottawa warriors loyal to Pontiac, was one fort quickly rebuilt to restore communications along Lake Erie. Pontiac's anger toward the British intensified once he learned the details of the Peace of Paris, announced in January of 1763. Under the treaty terms, all French claims in North America were transferred to the British. The one British attempt to placate the tribal peoples was the Proclamation of 1763. Traders now had to be licensed and trading restricted to government posts. The government also intended to negotiate the purchase of land from the tribes, establishing fixed boundaries to ensure orderly settlement of the frontier. Despite British efforts to control migration into the interior, the draw of free land and the inability of the government to enforce its restrictions set the stage for almost continuous violence on the frontier. Professor Hurt succinctly explains, "Respecting personal freedom more than law, and advocating their right to take unused land rather than to await negotiated settlements with the Trans-Appalachian Indians, these frontier people moved relentlessly into the Ohio Valley and soon cast covetous eyes to the rich lands west of the river. An estimated 50,000 whites were living on this frontier by 1774. More came every day. In 1768, under the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, the Iroquois ceded all title to land they claimed east and south of the Ohio River. White surveyors were moving into the region. The Shawnees took action to drive them back. Murders of whites by tribal warriors and murders of tribal people by whites became a daily occurrence. Hundreds of white settlers began to flee from the back country. Christianized people of the Lenni Lenape tribal group, referred to by Europeans as the Delaware, arrived from Pennsylvania in the summer of 1772. Moravian Christians under David Zeisberger attempted to establish a mission on the Tuscaroras River. As Professor Hurt writes, systematically, the Moravians worked to remake the economic, social, and political structure of Delaware society. However, not even the Moravians were able to introduce the European system of private land ownership among the tribal people. In contrast to colonial and American legal ownership systems, land tenure among the Ohio Indians depended on tribal sovereignty and actual use. Each tribe claimed sovereignty over an area that was fairly well recognized by other tribes. If the village moved, the chief allotted new lands based on family need, but usage rights passed down to the women in the lineage as long as they remained on that land. Generally, land could not be sold or inherited. Indeed, the land of the Native Americans could not be sold because it did not belong to the present generation. The present generation acted only as a trustee of the land for the generations yet unborn. In August of 1774, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, raised a force of militia to strike against the Shawnee. Dunmore sought to cement Virginia's land claims in the Ohio country. Dunmore knew that with the removal of the tribal people, land values would escalate, all to the benefit of speculators such as himself, and settled land would return important tax monies. The colonial forces were almost always untrained and undisciplined. They were often lured into traps and experienced heavy losses. But over time, the weight of numbers and a superior capacity to supply these forces forced the tribal warriors to retreat. The whites then burned the abandoned villages and whatever crops they found. Eventually, Lord Dunmore forced a peace on the Shawnees under which they promised to stay north of the Ohio River. There was no way to prevent whites, however, from pressing onward across the river. With war on the horizon between the British Empire and their colonial subjects, some Shawnee bands determined their best interests required that they move beyond the Ohio region. British traders operating out of Detroit provided whatever the tribes needed to induce their support against the colonial rebels. Warfare on the frontier took on a character rather distinct from that in the East, explained by Professor Hurt. The frontier people were Indian haters first, last, and always. For them, all Indians lived by murder and deserved death on sight. Yet, by killing prisoners, the Americans did not particularly differ from the Ohio Indians. Culture separated most of their actions in war, however, because the whites usually killed all Indian male prisoners and left the women and children unharmed, but also unadopted. In contrast, the Indians sacrificed a ritual few and considered adoption important for perpetuating their lineages. The colonials' war for independence from Great Britain proved to be a war of attrition. With French support, George Washington's army managed to trap Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown in late September of 1781. After that, the British will to continue the war gradually disappeared. The fate of Britain's North American colonies now became a pawn in the chess game played by factions in Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Each had territorial claims to protect. On the continent, a joint Spanish and French assault on British forces at Gibraltar failed. With so many issues to contend with, British negotiators consented to the independence of their 13 rebellious colonies. The treaty was signed in Paris on the 3rd of September 1783 and ratified by Congress on the 4th of January 1784. Back in the Ohio region, commissioners of the U.S. government forced a treaty on the Wyandots, the Delawares, the Ottawas, and the Ojibwas under which they ceded their land claims. The Shawnees and Miamis initially refused to sign away their land holdings, setting the stage for continued warfare. Passage of the Land Ordinance Act in 1785 provided for the survey and sale of the western lands ceded by the states or acquired from the tribal peoples. The price for land was set high enough to generate needed revenue for the operation of the federal government. Some of the survey lots were held back in anticipation of increases in the market price. One lot in each township was reserved for establishment of a public school within that township. At the same time, land was awarded to those who served in the Continental Army according to their rank. A major general received 1,100 acres, while an ensign received 150 acres. However, speculators bought up most of these land warrants from the veterans. At the end of the 19th century, the American political economist Henry George would view this massive sell-off of the public domain as a terrible tragedy. He wrote, "And as our population increases, the public domain becomes less and less, and the prospective value of land greater and greater. So will the desire of speculators to get hold of land increase, and unless there is a radical change in our land policy, we may expect to see the public domain passing into private hands at a constantly increasing rate." The danger that we have to fear is not the overcrowding, but the monopolization of our land. Not that there will not be land enough to support all, but that land will be so high that the poor man cannot buy it. That time is not very far distant. Then came passage by the Congress of the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, which established a framework for governing the territory and the eventual admission of new states to the United States of America. Not until 1794 did a huge U.S. Army commanded by General Anthony Wayne achieve a significant victory over the Confederated tribes at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The tribal leaders had no choice but to agree to terms. The Indians relinquished their land claims east and south of a line that ran up the Cuyahoga River from Lake Erie, then across the portage to the Tuscaroras River and on to Fort Lawrence. Then it ran westward to Fort Loramie and northwest to Fort Recovery, then south to the Ohio River. By so doing, the treaty gained the Great Miami Valley for settlement. If the tribal leaders who signed the treaty believed a permanent boundary had been established between themselves and the United States, they were almost immediately made aware that the hunger by whites for more and more land was far from satisfied. Land-hungry settlers flooded across the Ohio River without any intent to pay for land, the revenue needed to service and pay down the federal debt. The Army was authorized to drive off the squatters, destroy whatever cabins they constructed as well as crops they planted. Professor Hurt accurately summarizes the situation. Clearly, the Army was too small, the country too big, and the frontier people too numerous for the government to prevent illegal settling on lands west of the Ohio River. Only a new Indian war could drive the squatters out. That war was already brewing, but before it broke in 1789, the federal government began the first survey of its public lands. Investors now entered the picture. The Ohio Land Company of Associates was formed in Boston early in 1786, offering to purchase 1.5 million acres of land southwest of the Seven Ranges for $1 million, half to be paid immediately and the remainder on completion of the surveying. Their plan was to recreate well-designed and well-governed New England-style villages throughout their Ohio holdings. Because Congress permitted the company to pay for the land with depreciated government securities and land warrants, they acquired the grant for about 8.5 cents an acre. And early in April of 1788, the Ohio Company began construction of the town to be known as Marietta, in honor of Marie Antoinette of France. However, their plan to create a uniformly cultured society was almost immediately interrupted by the arrival of rough frontier people who settled nearby. The town and surrounding area had a population by 1810 of around 6,000. An act passed in 1800 permitted settlers to purchase public lands on credit, but the $2 per acre price was beyond the means of many who were squatting on the land. An amendment passed in 1804 permitted settlers to purchase 160 acres for $80 down and equal payments of $80 the following 3 years. The effect was to benefit small-scale farmers and provide them, in just a few years, with clear title. Because of the continuous influx of new settlers during the first decade of the 19th century, more than half of the land remained in the hands of speculators. Yet holders of small farms were able to produce more than enough for their own needs. However, producing for the market was coming. The Ohio Company began requiring each settler to plant at least 50 apple trees. By 1813, several thousand barrels of apples were being shipped to markets in Pittsburgh, Wheeling, and Cincinnati. The economic vitality of Ohio's slowly growing towns, such as Cincinnati, required attention to the demand for public goods and services. Raising the needed revenue meant taxes. As one business owner wrote at the time, "If we let the great landholders go exempt from taxes, they will keep their lands until their avarice is satisfied in the sales of them. If their property was taxed with that of the trader and poor tavern keeper, however, they would be obliged to sell their great tracts in small parcels to such people who would make immediate settlements." The main crop now being grown was corn, much of which was distilled into whiskey and sold to taverns that catered to soldiers. Drunkenness and its accompanying antisocial behavior was an ongoing problem for both the military and the settlers. It turns out that a high percentage of those who became landowners eventually sold out at a profit and moved on. As Professor Hurt observes, they treated land as a commodity to be acquired, used, and sold. Although some farmers failed and moved on, mobility indicated opportunity. Among those who remained were individuals whose landed wealth brought social recognition and political influence. Such was the case with Ohio's first U.S. Senators, Thomas Worthington and John Smith. After 4 years in the Senate, Worthington was elected governor. In 1798, the adult male population of Ohio reached 5,000, and the residents gained the right to elect a House of Representatives. William Henry Harrison was elected as the territory's representative to the U.S. Congress. The population continued to grow, and in 1803, Ohio was admitted to the United States as the 17th state. Chillicothe was selected as the state's first capital. Geography and the continued threat of attacks from still warlike tribal nations slowed the migration of whites to the Cuyahoga River and what would become Cleveland. Only about 60 people lived in the area by 1810. Only after the War of 1812 ended was it possible to make infrastructure improvements to the roads and the harbor that would link Cleveland with Albany, New York, and the Mohawk Valley. Those who did not have the financial means to either lease or purchase land found steady employment working to help farmers clear their land for plowing. Men were also needed to split rails for fences. Eventually, these workers might accumulate enough to purchase a tract of land for themselves. In 1796, Ebenezer Zane petitioned the Congress to allow him to build a road beginning from Wheeling, Virginia to Limestone, Kentucky. Zane would take payment in the form of land. Hardly fitting the description of an actual road, when completed late in 1797, it was gradually widened to allow for wagon access. Local landowners often made improvements by either widening or applying logs in wet areas to create corduroy sections of the road. The road stimulated the arrival of settlers, of creation of new towns along the way, and of increasing land values. By 1806, tensions between the United States and Britain had reached a point where almost everyone expected armed conflict. Now there was a growing concern among Ohioans that the British would enlist the Shawnees and other tribes in guerrilla warfare. The Shawnee warrior Tecumseh was in the process of trying to unite the western tribes and, from a position of strength, prevent any further loss of their lands. A declaration of war came on the 17th of June, 1812. The entire northwestern territory was soon exposed to British attack after the surrender of Detroit by U.S. General William Hull. Hull was eventually court-martialed for his actions and sentenced to be shot for cowardice and neglect of duty. The sentence was commuted by President James Madison in light of Hull's Revolutionary War record. The war in the Northwestern Territories was eventually won on the battlefield by forces under the command of William Henry Harrison and by Oliver Hazard Perry's naval victories on the Great Lakes. A peace treaty with the British was signed on the 24th of December, 1814. The tribes signed a treaty ending hostilities with the United States on the 8th of September, 1815. The remainder of Ohio was now ready to absorb more white settlers. The land of Ohio was now fully available for white occupancy and development. When the war ended, residents owned approximately 75% of Ohio's lands, while the Western Reserve had the largest acreage held by non-residents. At that same time, most Ohioans lived on farms or in towns with fewer than 100 people. Only Cincinnati, with a population of 9,642 in 1820, could be called a city. Ohio remained rural, but twilight had come to the frontier. By 1821, the federal government had sold a total of 7,300,000 acres, or 66% of the available federal lands. Another 1,400,000 acres was sold by the end of 1825. Speculators had turned over hundreds of thousands of acres as well. Ohioans were now a part of the larger trade economy, and they were not immune to the systemic weaknesses that brought on periods of economic boom and bust. Such was the case in 1819, when a financial panic spread across the nation. A major cause had been the reliance on loans to fund the intense speculation in western lands. A decade later, land near Cincinnati was selling for $100 an acre. By 1820, only New York and Pennsylvania surpassed Ohio in the value of manufactured goods. Also, Ohio ranked 5th nationally in the capital invested in its manufacturing enterprises, most of which drew upon the land for materials. An iron works at Zanesville ranked among the largest in the nation, with 158 employees. In 1825, the state government turned its attention to the formal education of its residents. Land in the sections designated to support public education was both leased and sold, although little revenue came from leases. Professor Hurt ends his study of Ohio's early history with an acknowledgement of the racial prejudice existed among Ohio's whites. He notes that although Ohio provided a major route north for the Underground Railroad, few blacks stayed in Ohio. Cincinnati resident Levi Coffin aided more than 3,000 enslaved persons to gain their freedom in Canada. Cultural beliefs that African Americans were inferior, as well as their increasing competition for jobs, led to a race riot in Cincinnati in 1829 and to the citizens of Portsmouth forcing the removal of 80 blacks from the town a year later. White settlers in the Scioto Valley also drove black farmers from their lands. Throughout the frontier period, then, with the exception of the Quakers and other abolitionists, Ohioans did not welcome African Americans, and the frontier did not serve as a land of equal opportunity when matters of race determined relationships. The era of canal building got underway in the 1820s, which increased the value of state-owned land adjacent to and near the canals. Sales of these land parcels brought in new revenue to the state. The revenue was not sufficient to make the canal building self-funding, but the canals opened new markets for whatever was produced. The final departure from Ohio of any remaining tribal peoples occurred in 1843, when the Wyandot people gathered their belongings and headed for a tract of land west of the Mississippi River awarded to them by the U.S. government.